If you have been pouring plain water on your cucumber plants week after week and wondering why the vines seem weak, the leaves lose their deep green color, and the harvest never matches your expectations, you may be making the same mistake that I made years ago. Most people believe that watering alone is enough because cucumbers grow fast and look healthy at first, but many plants slowly lose their strength long before anyone notices the warning signs. I have seen neighbors spend good money on expensive fertilizers, fancy bottles, and products with impressive labels, only to end the season with fewer cucumbers than they hoped for. That is why I want to share something that was shown to me many years ago by an older gardener who always seemed to harvest baskets of crisp cucumbers while everyone else complained about poor results. He did not promise miracles, and neither will I. He simply told me that some gardeners used a very mild aspirin water solution as part of their regular garden care, not as a magic cure, but as one small step alongside healthy soil, proper watering, and good growing habits. At first I smiled because it sounded too simple to matter, and I almost ignored his advice. Then I watched his plants through the season, and I noticed that they stayed healthy, looking much longer than many others nearby. That made me curious enough to try the method myself on only a few cucumber plants, while leaving the rest exactly the way I had always grown them. I wanted to see with my own eyes whether there was any difference before believing a single word. What happened over the following weeks surprised me enough that I kept repeating the same careful comparison year after year. I also discovered that many people who try this old gardening idea never see any benefit because they make one very common mistake before the watering can even touches the soil. They think the aspirin does all the work, but that is never how a good garden works. The small details before and after using it matter much more than most people realize, and if you miss those details, you may end up disappointed even if everything else looks right. Before I tell you exactly how I prepare and use this simple solution, you need to understand why most cucumber plants struggle long before the first yellow leaf appears, because that is where the real story begins. The biggest mistake I see is not that people refuse to try simple methods. The real mistake is believing that one ingredient can fix a plant that has already been neglected for weeks. I learned this lesson the hard way because I once thought that if I mixed something into the water, my cucumbers would suddenly become stronger, no matter what I had done before. That never happened. Healthy cucumber plants begin with loose soil, steady moisture, enough sunlight, and good air movement. If those basics are missing, no old trick will save the harvest. The older gardener who shared this idea with me repeated that point every single time we talked. He would smile and say that simple methods only help plants that already have a fair chance to grow well. Looking back, I understand exactly what he meant. Some seasons I noticed that people watered heavily for several days and then forgot their garden for another week. The soil became too dry, then too wet, and the plants stayed under constant stress. Others added fertilizer every few days because they believed more always meant better. Instead of stronger vines, they often ended up with beautiful leaves, but fewer cucumbers. That is why I stopped chasing quick solutions and began paying attention to the small habits that almost nobody talks about. When I experimented with a mild aspirin water solution, I never used it as a replacement for regular care. I treated it as only one small part of a much larger routine. I watered deeply instead of often. I kept the soil covered with mulch, so moisture stayed longer. I removed damaged leaves before they became a problem. I watched the plants every morning instead of waiting until something looked wrong. Those little habits cost almost nothing, yet they changed my garden more than any expensive bottle from a store shelf. Many gardeners miss this because they are looking for one dramatic answer instead of several simple steps working together. That is also why some people say an old method works while others insist it does nothing. They are not always comparing the same conditions. Before I ever mixed a single tablet into water, I made sure the plants were already growing in the best environment I could give them. Only then did I begin my small comparison, and one particular detail about preparing the solution turned out to be far more important than I expected. That tiny detail is where most gardeners make another mistake without even realizing it, and it completely changes the result they hope to see. The first time I prepared this old mixture, I almost ruined the whole experiment because I thought a little more would surely be better. That is how most gardeners make mistakes. We often believe that if a small amount may help, then a larger amount must work even faster. Plants simply do not work that way. The older man who showed me this method laughed when he saw what I was about to do and told me to put the extra tablets back in the box. He said the goal was never to force the cucumber plant to grow. The goal was to avoid putting unnecessary stress on it while giving it consistent care through the entire season. From that day on, I stopped chasing stronger mixtures and focused on being patient instead. If I decided to use aspirin water, I always prepared only a very mild solution and applied it occasionally, rather than making it part of every watering. I also made sure the soil was already slightly moist before using it because I never wanted dry roots to receive any concentrated mixture. That simple habit made much more sense to me than pouring anything onto thirsty soil. Another thing I noticed over the years was that many gardeners rush to use every new trick as soon as they transplant young cucumbers. I never do that. Newly planted cucumbers already need time to settle into their new home. During those first days, I simply give them clean water, protect them from strong afternoon heat if necessary, and allow the roots to establish naturally. Only after the plants begin producing healthy new growth do I even think about trying any additional garden practice. That little bit of patience often saves far more problems than people realize. There is another detail that almost nobody mentions. I never test a new method on every cucumber plant at once. If I have 10 plants, I may try it on only 2 or 3 while caring for the others exactly as usual. That way I can compare everything with my own eyes instead of depending on stories from other people or promises printed on colorful packages. Gardening has taught me that every yard is different. The weather changes, the soil changes. Even 2 gardens on the same street can behave differently. That is why I trust careful observation more than excitement. Still, there was one season when those few test plants began showing a difference that caught my attention much earlier than I expected. It was not the number of cucumbers that surprised me first. It was something much easier to notice, and once I saw it, I started paying much closer attention for the rest of the summer. The first thing I noticed was not bigger cucumbers or longer vines. It was the leaves. They stayed firm, rich green, and full of life, while some of the nearby plants had already begun showing small signs of stress. That alone did not prove anything, because every season is different, but it was enough to make me keep watching, instead of making quick conclusions. I continued caring for every plant, the same way with regular watering, mulch, and removing damaged leaves whenever I saw them. The only difference was that a few plants occasionally received the same mild aspirin water solution that had been shown to me years before. I never treated it as something special. I was simply another small step in a routine built on patience. Many people ask me how often I use it, expecting some complicated schedule. My answer usually surprises them because less is often better. I do not use it every week, and I certainly do not replace normal watering with it. Plain, clean water remains the most important thing a cucumber plant needs. The mild solution is only an occasional addition during active growth, never something I depend on. Another habit that I believe makes a much bigger difference is watering early in the morning. That gives the soil time to absorb moisture before the strongest heat arrives and allows the leaves to stay dry as the day warms up. I also water at the base of the plant instead of over the leaves because wet foliage can encourage unnecessary problems. These are simple habits that cost nothing, yet many gardeners still overlook them while searching for expensive answers. There is another old lesson that has stayed with me through the years. Never judge your garden after 1 or 2 days. Plants need time to respond to any change in care. Every morning I simply walked through the garden with a cup of coffee, looked at the leaves, checked the soil with my fingers, and paid attention to the little details. Those quiet moments taught me more than any gardening book ever did. Sometimes I noticed a small improvement. Sometimes I noticed no difference at all. That is exactly why I always tell people to observe before deciding whether any method is useful in their own garden. What surprised me most came a little later when the flowering period began. That was the moment I realized that the real value of careful gardening is not hidden inside one tablet or one bottle, but in understanding how several small habits work together. And one particular habit during flowering completely changed the way I cared for cucumbers from that season forward. When the first flowers begin to appear, that is when many gardeners become too eager and accidentally slow the very harvest they are hoping for. I used to think that flowering meant the hard work was over, but over the years I realized it is actually the time when the plants need the most steady and careful attention. I never change everything at once during this stage. I keep watering consistently. I continue checking the soil instead of watering by habit, and I avoid adding one product after another just because the plants are covered with blossoms. If I decide to use the mild aspirin water solution, I still use it only occasionally and never as a substitute for proper garden care. I have found that consistency almost always beats excitement. One mistake that few people talk about is allowing the soil to swing between completely dry and soaking wet. Cucumbers dislike that kind of stress, and even healthy-looking plants can begin dropping flowers or producing uneven fruit if moisture changes too much from one week to the next. That is why I always keep a layer of straw, dried grass, or another natural mulch around the plants. It helps the soil stay evenly moist, keeps weeds under control, and saves both water and time. This simple habit costs almost nothing, yet many gardeners skip it while searching for more complicated solutions. Another lesson I learned many years ago is to remove yellow or damaged leaves as soon as I notice them. I never strip the plant bare, but I do remove leaves that are clearly finished because good air movement around the vines helps the plants stay healthier throughout the season. I also avoid walking through the cucumber bed when the leaves are wet because that can spread problems from one plant to another without anyone realizing it. These are small habits that become second nature after enough seasons in the garden. People often ask me whether the aspirin water is the secret behind a successful cucumber harvest. I always tell them the same thing. There is no single secret. Good soil, steady watering, healthy plants, careful observation, and simple routines work together. The old method is only one small piece of a much larger picture. What convinced me to continue using it from time to time was not one spectacular harvest, but the fact that over several seasons, I kept seeing the same pattern when the basic conditions in the garden were already good. Then something happened near the end of one particularly difficult summer that taught me perhaps the most valuable lesson of all, and after that season, I never looked at cucumber plants in quite the same way again. Near the end of one summer, we went through almost 3 weeks without proper rain. The days were hot, the nights stayed warm, and many gardens around me began to look tired. I remember walking outside every morning expecting to find my cucumber vines fading like so many others, but instead, I noticed that the plants I had cared for patiently throughout the season were holding on much better than I expected. They were not perfect because no garden ever is, but they continued producing fresh cucumbers while many people had already accepted that their season was almost finished. That experience taught me something I have never forgotten. A garden does not reward shortcuts. It rewards small, steady habits, repeated over and over again. Whether I occasionally used a mild aspirin water solution or not, the biggest difference always came from paying attention before problems became obvious. I stopped waiting for yellow leaves to remind me to water. I stopped guessing when the soil needed moisture and started checking it with my own hands. I learned to harvest cucumbers regularly because leaving overgrown fruit on the vines often slows the production of new ones. Every 2 or 3 days, I walked through the garden with a small basket, picking cucumbers while they were still firm and tender. That simple routine encouraged the plants to keep producing instead of putting all their energy into oversized fruit. Another old habit I still follow is keeping the garden clean throughout the season. Fallen leaves, damaged fruit, and weeds are removed before they become larger problems. For it takes only a few minutes each visit, but it saves hours of work later. People sometimes ask me why my garden seems so calm. I tell them it is because I never try to solve every problem in one afternoon. I solve little problems while they are still little. Looking back over all these years, I believe that mindset has helped me far more than any product I have ever bought. The occasional old gardening method simply became part of that careful routine rather than the center of it. By the time autumn began to arrive, I found myself carrying more cucumbers into the kitchen than I expected, and the biggest surprise was not the number itself. It was realizing how much money I had saved by relying on simple habits, careful observation, and inexpensive ideas, instead of constantly searching for another expensive promise in a brightly colored bottle. There was one final lesson that brought all of these experiences together, and once I understood it, gardening became much simpler and far more enjoyable than it had ever been before. When I look back at all the seasons I have spent growing cucumbers, I realize that the biggest changes did not come from buying expensive products or chasing every new gardening trend. They came from slowing down, paying attention, and trusting simple routines that had already helped generations of gardeners before me. That is why I still enjoy spending quiet mornings in the garden. I walk between the rows, check the leaves, feel the soil with my fingers, and let the plants tell me what they need instead of guessing. If I decide to use a mild aspirin water solution, I always remember that it is only one small part of the entire picture. Healthy soil, regular watering, mulch, good airflow, and harvesting cucumbers before they become oversized are still the real foundation of a productive garden. Nothing replaces those habits. I have learned that the simplest methods are often the easiest to repeat, and that is exactly why they become valuable year after year. Gardening should not leave you worried or constantly reaching for another expensive bottle from the store. It should give you confidence because you understand your plants a little better with every season. Even when something does not go exactly as planned, there is always another lesson waiting for you. That is what keeps me coming back to the garden every morning. Every year teaches me something new, even after decades of growing vegetables. If this old method makes you curious, try it carefully on only a few healthy cucumber plants and compare the results with the rest of your garden. Watch patiently, take notes, and trust what you see with your own eyes instead of believing every claim you hear. Your garden is unique, and your experience will always be more valuable than anyone else's opinion. In the end, the greatest reward is not only a basket full of fresh cucumbers, it is knowing that you grew them with simple habits, careful observation, and a little patience instead of depending on costly solutions. That feeling never gets old. Every season begins with hope, every harvest brings another lesson, and every small success reminds me why I never stopped gardening. If you enjoyed spending these few minutes with me, stay curious because there are many more forgotten garden habits that deserve another chance, and one of them completely changed the way I grow tomatoes, saving both time and money while making every season a little easier than the one before.